on different topics in meta research, open science, and all that sort of good stuff. And today we've got Anisa Rowhani-Farid speaking, and she's a postdoctoral fellow in the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy with a broad background in medical research and public health, but more specifically with a focus on meta research. Her first postdoctoral fellowship was the Collaboration for Research Integrity and Transparency at Yale Law School and at the Centre for Outcomes Research and Evaluation at Yale School of Medicine. And her doctorate was from Queensland University of Technology in Australia, in Brisbane. And today Anisa is going to be talking about the RIAT initiative, not to be confused with Riot, which is the name of our seminar series. And RIAT stands for Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials. And we were actually introduced to the RIAT initiative by a previous speaker at one of these talks, Larissa Shamshir, and we were keen to hear more about her work. So yeah, I think we decided just now that it would be good to sort of take questions throughout and to possibly have some informal chats. But yeah, also feel free to post any questions in the chat during the talk. So Anisa, over to you. Hopefully you should be able to share screen now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hugo. I'm going to try sharing my screen and then I'll proceed. Is this working?
Yeah, we can see that so far.
Okay, great. Let me just try the presenter mode.
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, great. Let me just move this slightly. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Hugo, for this wonderful welcome and introduction. I'm so grateful to be here. As Hugo already mentioned, I'm a postdoc at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, at the University of, at the RIAT initiative, which is Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials. So, RIAT is an international effort to tackle publication bias by publishing unpublished randomized controlled trials and correcting the reporting of inaccurately or incompletely reported randomized controlled trials. So today I'm going to be, as Hugo already mentioned, I'm going to be talking about RIAT, its mission and its framework. And I'm also going to be sharing a little bit about my own research, ever since I got into this field when I started my PhD. Okay, so the problem that motivated RIAT into existence is this. So we know from decades of meta research that there are two serious problems that affect the scientific literature. So not all trials that are conducted are published, and not all that are published are adequately reported. So some are actually misreported. Yet these publications, which might present a rosier picture of the evidence than the data actually show, go on to affect clinical decision-making through guidelines, systematic reviews, and the popular press. So the question is, what can we do about this? So we believe data and transparency is one of the real keys to addressing this problem. Okay, so what is RIAT? So I'm just going to read that. So I already kind of mentioned it. It's an international effort to tackle bias in the way research is published, with the goal of providing more accurate information to patients and other healthcare decision makers. So we're ensuring trial publications are accurate, complete, and that data are publicly available. So the initiative was launched through this publication in the BmJ, with the tip of the iceberg, being what we see. So that's the trial publication. But the bottom of the iceberg includes thousands of pages of regulatory data, like clinical study reports, case report forms, informed consent forms, individual participant data. So this is kind of, what RIAT is all about, is about this deep dive into the ocean to understand, what's hidden beneath the waterline. So the RIAT initiative issued a call to action in 2013, calling on institutions that funded and investigators who conducted abandoned trials to publish in the case of unpublished trials, or formally correct or republish in the case of misreported trials, their studies. So an example of RIAT is this highly influential study in 2001. So it helped drive sales of paroxetine for depression in kids, concluding the drug was safe and effective. But our RIAT reanalysis of the data published 14 years later and after accessing the underlying patient data came to the exact opposite conclusion. So the drug was neither effective nor safe. So there's growing evidence, so there's growing access to regulatory data starting to reveal parts of the previously invisible iceberg of trial data. And this is what makes RIAT possible. So it's not just researchers we need, we call these researchers rioters who are taking that deep dive. So these are the ones who are willing to go and request the data and get access to the data and take that deep dive into the data. But we also need journals who are willing to publish reports of clinical trials written by people who are not the original trialists. So this is new, and many journals have never done this, but some, we call them RIAT-friendly journals, like the BmJ, PLOS Medicine, JAMA, and the Lancet, have made clear that they're willing to entertain such publications. And so that's why we created the RIAT Support Center. So we're helping people to navigate this vast new landscape of access to data through how-tos and support. And we also launched a new campaign in this previous year in 2021, which I'll tell you more about. But first, a few quick slides to show you what's on our website. So we have a variety of how-tos, so practical guides on how to find data, how to approach journals, which journals, guides on the universe of trial and regulatory documents, things like CSRs, clinical study reports, CRFs, case report forms, medical officer reviews, and so on. We created a glossary for those because we learned that much of this was a new world, even for people with great familiarity with trials, but no industry or regulatory experience. So we also have detailed steps on how to RIAT. So these steps ensure to make sure the process of making a claim of misreporting and reanalysis is legitimate, fair, and auditable. And here's just the glossary that I mentioned of regulatory documents. So, and then from 2018 to 2020, we ran 3 competitions and we gave out around $750,000 for people to conduct these deep dive RIATs. So you can see our competition team winners here. So our competitions are very exciting. Each team got around $150,000 to take this deep dive into a trial that was either, that was misreported or unreported. And we're awaiting, a series of RIAT publications coming out in the next year or so. So yeah, here are the competition winners from 2019. So this is the RIAT Expressions of Concern campaign that I mentioned about earlier. It's something new. So we're giving away about $1,000 awards to people who are interested in doing something about publication and reporting bias. So the idea behind the campaign is to highlight the inadequacies in the publication of clinical trials, and just to show that it's not an old problem that's gone away. It's not a problem nobody cares about anymore. It's not limited to a certain therapeutic area, and it's not something that one particular team of academics cares about. So the idea is to make those concerns about under misreporting, trial design flaws, and inadequate transparency more visible. And one way we think we can do that is through letters to the editor. So these are short letters that highlight big problems with a trial. So they don't need to conduct a full reanalysis. They just need to attempt to lodge concern about a problem in the public record. So we know that not all of these letters will be published. So we will be showcasing them all on our website, which will also give visibility to the problems at journals which refuse to engage in the correction of the literature. And so to help galvanize this, we can offer teams $1,000 awards to write 2 to 3 letters, with the agreement that they'll also serve as pre-submission peer reviewers for others' letters. So of course, you'll have to disclose our funding if you accept it. So please go to our website and be in touch if this is something you might be involved in. We think these awards would make great for small projects for trainees. So here's an example of a RIAT expression of concern that was written by the RIAT team. So it was written about the lack of data shared from the COVID-19 vaccine trial. The letter was rejected, but on our website, we document the full correspondence with the New England Journal of Medicine editor regarding their decisions. So yeah, thank you for listening. RIAT is one way to address the problems with the literature. So please get involved. Here's our email and our Twitter if you're interested to get involved with RIAT. I can pause here and take some questions about Riot and then move on to the next portion of my presentation, which is more specifically about my own personal research.
Can I ask a question quickly about just where does the funding for these prizes and so on come from?
Sure, good question. So the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So they're now called Arnold Ventures. So they were, I think it's a family initiative, philanthropists who were interested in correcting the literature, who got very excited about, I believe it was Brian Nosek's team originally at the Center for Open Science. And they got involved with funding him. And I believe that's how it kind of started. And, now they fund a couple of teams around the world. They were even the main people who funded, my previous postdoc at Yale as well. And yeah, so there's a couple of teams around. I even believe Ben Goldacre's team might receive funding from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So yeah, it's a great thing that they funded us, because it's one thing I must say, being in this field, which is so kind of niche, it's hard to, kind of convince funders that this is something that's fundable, because you can't always see immediate results. It's a cultural shift towards more open data, more transparency. And so it's sometimes difficult to show that there's change that's happening, because it really is a cultural thing that, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of people who need to get involved for this movement to kind of, gain momentum. But hopefully we get more and more people, like governmental bodies, funding these endeavors for sure.
Yeah, I think finding funding is one of those tricky things in medicine. But yeah, it's not. There's a question from Rebecca.
Please, yes.
Yeah, hiya. Thanks, it's really interesting. I was wondering, how do the rioters find or select the studies to reinvestigate?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that I was wondering about when I first started. I believe it's familiarity with the field. Like a lot of them are like pharmacists or clinical pharmacists who've been in the field for some time, or physicians who've read the evidence and have, maybe done a little bit of searching around, maybe looking at what was pre-registered or pre-specified in their protocol and what they actually ended up publishing. So, they're curious. They're like, this doesn't look accurate. This doesn't make sense. So that's when I believe, they kind of decide to take a deep dive into things.
Thank you.
Sure. Shall I move on?
Yeah, fantastic logo as well for Riot. I think that is like one of the, it's really, yeah, it really is the point in a logo.
It is a pretty good logo. I should agree with that. All right.
Yeah, could I ask a quick question?
Of course, please go ahead.
So it seems like there's some overlap with the kind of stuff that Ben Goldacre's lab's doing, but it's, a lot of what they do seems to be more kind of like the documenting the problem, whereas from what you said, it sounds like it's a lot more about trying to overcome and like take active steps. Would you say that's like a fair kind of characterization?
Yeah, I think that's a fair distinction, very similar to their campaigns. One of their campaigns that they launched, they had the All Trials campaign and then the Compare campaign. So this one, I would say, our expressions of concern campaign is probably quite similar to Compare. But I believe that was for a short period of time, for like 1 year or 2 years, where they, were looking at trials that were published in that particular year, if I'm not misunderstanding exactly what they did. But anyways, we're very similar to what they do. And of course, yes, if rioters are willing to take that deep dive, that's the main distinction. But we've found that that's kind of really hard to do, because, that's a couple of years of work, where you're going to have to get access to the data. You're very unsure if you're going to get access to the data. There's a lot of loopholes and lots of loops to jump through. And, it's just, it gets a little bit challenging, and, it's a full-time job. So, like that's why we didn't have that many people apply for our competitions, to receive that $150,000 to do the deep dive. So that's one other thing that, okay, there's a problem, but do we have resources? Do we have capacity out there to be able to, to recognize, okay, there's a problem, but I want to do something, I don't even know where to start. and how do I even do this, so I think that's something that I've noticed, as a postdoc being here, that, there haven't been that many people who've, put their hand up to say, I want to do this and I want to dedicate like a year or two of my research career to doing a massive RIAT. But yeah, sorry, that was a long way of answering your question. But yeah, we're very similar to what Ben Goldacre has been doing, for sure.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I'm just thinking about Rebecca's question about how do you identify those kind of studies to do a deep dive on, and it feels like some of the people that are already doing this sort of scoping work in terms of Ben Goldacre's lab, and also my old colleague Robert Thibault, who did a discrepancy review looking at trials and like whether or not the published outcomes switched versus like the clinical trials. And so you've almost got like potentially existing data sets there for people who would like to do RIATs. So
Exactly.
like, okay, well, like the studies have been identified. Can it go one step further? And I think that'd be interesting to look into.
Totally. Yeah, that's a good place to start. Like there are people who've already studied this as like a review, so then you can go and see, oh, what trial was that? Let me just see if I can like try to understand what their protocol was. And so I did that for like one of our expressions of concern. I went to one of those papers that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at misreporting of depression trials, and I found one, but some of these trials are really old, like published in 2002, so will we ever really get access to the data, like the deep data, or is it just going to be like an expression of concern, like, hey, like, this is what was pre-specified in the protocol, this is actually what they ended up reporting. And so we wrote an expression of concern, and there's like no response from the journal, so I think that's the other problem, like there's that lack of response or that lack of engagement from journals is something that is a huge barrier, to change, so we're documenting these things on our website. But then again, how much traction is our website getting? How much attention are we bringing to this issue of misreporting and underreporting of trials? So yeah, it's something that I think, as I mentioned, it just requires a lot of people getting on board, flagging these things, maybe posting them on Twitter, or, finding other ways of raising awareness about the issues. Because yeah, like if it's published and then we think that it's, set in stone and it's like there and there's nothing wrong with it. But I think the problem is probably the way we do research anyway. The whole publication system of journals, is probably at the heart of the problem too, that, it's published and there's nothing wrong with it and it's good to go forever, but that's not science. Science evolves, it's a living thing, it needs to be constantly changing and evolving, based on more and more data that's collected. So yeah, I think the problem is a lot bigger than just the publications, it's the way we do research too, and the way we share our findings.
But I guess at least you guys have some, funding available for these things. So that in itself is quite something to sort of attract people in, hopefully, because people, funding is always something that people are keen for.
Right, exactly. So, it's kind of attractive, $1,000 for postdocs or PhDs, or even just, researchers who have some spare time. And they're like, hey, I noticed that this trial, had some weird things in their publication, maybe spin, maybe a little bit of hyping up their findings, what if I just lodge a concern, at the journal itself. And even if they reject your, expression of concern, of course, you still get the funding. Like the funding isn't dependent on whether or not they accept your expression of concern. So it's just about, kind of getting people involved and getting people, interested in writing these letters. So yeah, please, if you're interested, get involved. Our funding's running out. So, whatever we have left over, we have to probably return. So yeah, please, write us if you're interested.
There's a question from
yes.
more about the process, I guess, in terms of is getting the data the part that takes the longest, and also how long does it take on average to do a deep dive, and what sort of team structure, size of teams are normally typical for these?
Yeah, this is a good question. Based on my own experience, being here with a lot of the teams had probably already, some of the teams had already kind of gotten access to data prior to my starting. But, I would say getting access to the data, also like I think the pandemic impacted a lot of people's, ability to get access to data quickly. But these days, Health Canada has a lot of data that's actually on their website. So that has made things a lot easier for people. A lot of clinical trials now have access to data, clinical study reports, case report forms, and basically published on Health Canada's website, which is incredible. So that's a really good thing that has, I think, shifted, the amount of time that it takes to get access to data. But still, that's an anomaly. Like not all trials are published, have their data there. If they do, that's great. Like you can just literally go and like download. But, I must say, I don't know the average time that it takes, but I'm going to estimate that it's between 6 months to a year to get access to data. That's just my own, off the top of my head estimate as to how long it takes to get data. And the deep dive itself, like, as I mentioned, a lot of our RIAT publications haven't really come out yet. And some of them have taken years, like one study, I think we're still waiting on the results to be published, and they started in around 2018, 2019. So, these are big dives, teams are involved, they have a postdoc. I must say some of them have like a couple of research scientists, statisticians are really important on being on board to do the reanalysis. So some of the teams are like 4 to 5 people. Some of them are smaller, like 1 to 2. So yeah, it really just depends from team to team.
Thanks. Yeah, if there aren't any more questions, then I guess we can go on to the next bit. And if anybody has any other things to suggest, we'll have a bit more time at the end.
Yes, please. Thank you. It's okay, you can see everything? Okay, great. Oops. Okay, so a bit about me. I grew up in a little island called Vanuatu. It's in the heart of the Pacific, next to Australia. And as Hugo mentioned, I did my PhD at the Institute of Health and Biomedical Innovation at QUT. That's Adrian Barnett, my PhD advisor, and Ginny Barber was one of my mentors as well. So she was at my university, which is such a wonderful, I was so grateful to have both of them as my mentors. So yeah, I did my first fellowship at CRIT, so the Collaboration for Research Integrity and Transparency at Yale, and my second fellowship here, the University of Maryland. So yeah, just what is meta research? We've been using this term a lot today. So in the scientific discourse, meta research is kind of a new term. So it refers to research on research. So Ioannidis in 2015, he wrote this paper describing meta research as taking like a bird's eye view of science, and they define it as an evolving scientific discipline that aims to evaluate and improve research practices. So they divide meta research into 5 major areas of activity: methods, reporting, reproducibility, evaluation, and incentives. So these 2 cartoons pictured here perfectly depict the issues in research. So the first one shows the inaccuracy of scientific reporting, where the scientists are basically slipping and falling off the data points on the graph. And the second one shows a large amount of waste that comes from health and medical research, with the liquid in the pipette turning into waste coming out of the test tube. So just a little bit more information about the 5 areas of meta research. So this is directly from that paper by Ioannidis et al. So methods has to do with the act of performing research. Reporting involves the communication of research. Reproducibility has to do with verifying research. Evaluation has to do with evaluating research. And incentives has to do with rewarding research. So of course, the areas of activity overlap, and they're all intimately connected. And I've led 6 first co-author studies in 3 areas of research activity: reporting, reproducibility, and incentives. And I'll share a little bit more about them, the conceptual and some empirical information about them in my presentation today. Oops. Okay, so to follow on from the topic of waste in research, as the previous cartoon with the pipette tip depicted, there was a series published in The Lancet, which I think we're all familiar with, in 2014, that discussed the large amount of waste in research. So Chalmers and Glasio estimated that 85% of the world's spending on health and medical research is wasted per year. That's around $170 billion, US dollars per year. So one main reason behind this large amount of waste is bias. So both at the level of publication, where 50% of completed clinical trials are never published, which is kind of what Riot is trying to address. And again, 50% of completed clinical trials and at the level of outcomes, 50% of planned study outcomes are never reported. Further, research has shown that clinical trials with negative results are more likely to remain unpublished than those with positive results. So again, this all kind of falls under the work of Riot and other teams like Ben Goldacre's as well. So the inconsistency of reporting can also be spin, like as I kind of mentioned earlier. So spin in research, it's been defined as reporting practices that distort the interpretation of results and mislead readers so that results are viewed in a more favorable light, or as science hype. So just like this cartoon by Hilda Bastian, which I really like. So certain practices have been employed to spin results. These include inappropriate claims, inappropriate extrapolations, or recommendations for clinical practice, selective reporting, and more robust or favorable data presentations. So my postdoc at Yale and my current work at Riot has to do with looking at misreporting of clinical trials, particularly where researchers switch their outcomes or inadequately describe their methods and results. Excuse me. So research reproducibility is concerned with verifying research by promoting the sharing of raw data, code, and methods, and to ensure that research is repeatable and reproducible by others to validate findings and progress research further and faster. So in 2012, there was a study that found that 47 out of 53 cancer research papers published in Nature were irreproducible. In a survey conducted by Nature itself in 2016, 90% of readers agreed that the scientific community is in the midst of a reproducibility crisis. There was a more recent study by Danchev et al. In 2021 that showed that out of 334 clinical trials published in top journals like JAMA, Lancet, and New England Journal of Medicine, and these trials declared data sharing, only 2 individual patient-level data sets were actually publicly available. So the problem is still there, even after all these years of meta-researchers kind of bringing everyone's attention to this issue of the lack of data sharing. We're still in the midst of it. So there are many ways to institute behavioral change, but history and the psychological literature suggests that motivating change with reward is more effective than motivating change with punishment. So currently researchers get little credit for data sharing, and so there's a cultural reluctance to publish data openly. So it might be beneficial to change the criteria by which scientists and their teams are rewarded for their efforts by agencies that fund them and institutions that host them. So the criteria should be aligned with the desired outcomes. An example designed to encourage good research behavior is the PQRSD criteria, which was designed by Ioannidis et al. So productive, high quality, reproducible, shareable, and translatable. So researchers who address all 5 criteria would advance rather than the current incentive, which is dominated by publish or perish. So of course, again, we need funding agencies, universities, research institutions, who must all come together to address the crucial issue of academic credit and devise methods that recognize and reward data sharing and encourage a culture of openness. Okay, so as a part of my PhD and fellowships, I've carried out a couple of studies. This first one, and so the studies were to better understand the landscape of researchers' data sharing and outcome switching practices, as well as the incentives and policies out there to promote the sharing of data. So the systematic review that I did was to understand what evidence-based incentives were out there to motivate researchers to share data in health and medical research. So the systematic review identified that there was only one incentive that had been tested to motivate researchers to share their data, and it was an open data badge that was offered at the journal Psychological Science, and it improved data sharing from 1.5% pre-badges to 39% post-badges. So this was a great study and it received a lot of attention. The only problem was that it wasn't a randomized controlled trial. It was an observational study. And so the high increase in data sharing could not solely be attributed to badges alone, as there were other changes at the journal as well. So we were interested to see what data sharing rates were like in a health and medical journal like the BmJ. So we went ahead and did that. It was an observational study. So we found that the data sharing rates at the BmJ were quite low at 4.5%. And at 24% for those studies bound by the policy, so namely clinical trials were actually required to share their data. Compared to a previous study conducted 15 years prior, the rate of data sharing did not increase by much since that time. So it was 3% before, and now it was like 4.5%. Since 2009, though, which is when our study period was, the rate of data promised had increased by 40%. However, we found that even when researchers promised to share their data in their data sharing statements, they reveal caveats and reasons not to share when asked. So we found that the journal Biostatistics, moving on to another study, had been offering badges for data sharing, code sharing, and reproducibility since 2009. So we carried out another observational study to see what the data sharing and code sharing rates were at that journal. So our results showed that the effect of badges on data sharing at Biostatistics was only 7.3%, and that only 0.6% and only 0.6% for code sharing. We concluded that a randomized control trial was needed to determine the true effect of badges. So of course, these results were so different to the results at psychological science, which is why we thought, it's a good idea to do a randomized control trial to get some more information about, maybe the true effect of badges. So we designed and conducted a randomized control trial of badges at BmJ Open. My advisor, Adrian Barnett, had just been asked to be on the editorial board, I believe, of BmJ Open. So we got in touch with Adrian Aldcroft, who is the editor-in-chief of BmJ Open, and we asked, would we be able to collaborate together to do this research, and they were very interested. So we moved forward with it. So it was a parallel group randomized control trial, and open data badges were awarded to the intervention group if they publicly shared their data at a third-party public repository. So the primary outcome was the data sharing rate. So our results found that badges did not significantly motivate researchers to publicly share their data. The odds ratio was 0.9. But since the confidence interval is wide, we cannot rule out an effect of badges that would have practical significance. So yeah, this was interesting, to see that, there was not really much of a badge effect. But of course, our study had limitations. Originally, we wanted our control group to, just kind of be monitored just to see what they do. Like, do they share their data? Yes, or will they share their data? Yes or no? But our ethics committee at my old university in Australia was kind of risk averse. And they thought that it was really important to get their consent too. So we had to people had to opt in into our study. Even the control group had to opt in, even though we could have just monitored their data sharing behavior because it's all publicly available information anyway. So our sample size was reduced because of that. But nevertheless, we still had good amount of studies to be able to conclude that badges did not significantly motivate researchers to share their data. But of course, future studies can design trials that are conducted differently. That was one of our conclusions, that maybe, and we got in touch with Brian Nosek about it, and he agreed that maybe, next time a trial can be designed at the level of the journal instead of at the level of the individual. So we can run kind of like a cluster randomized control trial where one journal could offer badges, another journal does not offer badges, and just to kind of, see what that could show. Okay, so we're currently, this is another study. So in the process of extracting more data for this cross-sectional study, comparing the outcomes of two NIH, so the National Institutes of Health at the US, two NIH institutes data sharing models. So the NHLBI, which is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institutes model, it's a centralized model where, which is actually a lot more effective, which we think is a lot more effective. It's like a depository where trialists share their data. They deposit it there, and then people can go to BioLink, which is their repository, and download data or request it. And then the NCI, which is the National Cancer Institute, more recently has adopted a more centralized model as well. But we wanted to compare their old model, which is what a lot of people still do, which is kind of like, they used to have these cooperative groups, which are like collaborations, and you have to apply to these cooperative groups if you're interested in using data, and then they have to decide whether or not you get access. So it's kind of cumbersome, and you don't, to be honest, I feel like you don't even know where to start. You might be interested in accessing data, and you're like, okay, where do I go? So we wanted to just kind of show which model was effective by actually studying how much. So first of all, how much data is being generated from each model, and then looking at how much shared data publications are being generated using shared data. So for those studies that shared data, then looking at how many publications actually came from external authors who use that data to generate new research. And so, you know, what was the number of those publications, how many publications were out there, and also what's the impact, like where were they published, what's their abstract views, what are their citation counts, what's the altmetric score of that publication, what's the H-index of the journal which published those journals, just to measure, like do a comparison between each model to show, you know, which one has higher impact in terms of getting more knowledge out there and shared with a greater number of people. So, you know, as I mentioned, we had to go back and get more data. It's a big study, and, you know, it took a lot of time. So now I have someone helping me use web scraping, an automation tool to get more of these impact measures easily accessible instead of doing lots of clicking. So hopefully we can publish this soon and we can have the results out there. But preliminary research suggests that the data sharing model at the NHLBI is more effective at increasing the data sharing rate and possibly increasing the impact of shared data publications that are generated using shared data. Okay, now this is another study, and we were interested to examine the extent to which clinical trials presented at major international medical conferences in 2016 transparently and consistently reported their study design, endpoints, and results across conference abstracts and published manuscript abstracts. So kind of, you know, we were interested to see, you know, like there's these big conferences, right? Like ARVO, which is the one for vision and it's an ophthalmology research conference, and, you know, there's ASCO, which is the one for cancer research. You know, there are all of these conferences, and typically they happen in the United States every year. And each one attracts like 10,000 to 15,000 people. And these are like, you know, scientists, clinical trialists, physicians, academics, other researchers, journalists, you know, students, people who are involved in that area of work. And, you know, we originally wanted to study late breaker clinical trials, you know, the ones that are like hot off the press, no one's really heard their findings yet, or they're just about to publish them. And, you know, they're in front of this big crowd and they're sharing their findings. So we wanted to see, you know, what are they actually saying at the conference versus what actually ends up happening to the publication, you know, to the publication. Does it actually get published? Did they share consistent results between what they shared at the conference and what they actually published in the end? And so is there evidence of kind of like spin happening from like what they share in a conference in front of 10,000 people, which could impact, you know, a physician's or, you know, a researcher's practice versus what actually ends up going to publication. So our sample included 240 clinical trials presented at 12 major conferences. We also looked, some outcomes were that we were interested to look at registration rates of these trials. So we found that actually it was quite high. So around just over 86% were registered. A much lower proportion were reported summary results at clinicaltrials.gov or in a registry. You know, not all of them were based in the United States, but, you know, we have other registries from all around the world. So only, you know, 39.6% reported the results in the registry. The publication rate was still low. You know, I would say that, you know, we're aiming for 100% publication. All of these studies should be published, but, you know, we still have around a quarter of them that need to be published, or I don't know if they'll ever get published because this is from 2016. So it's a long time has passed. So you would think that all of them would be published by now. But among the 177 papers that were published, around 96.6 reported consistent primary efficacy endpoints across conference and publication abstracts, you know, which is actually quite high. So, you know, we just compared, you know, what was the primary outcome that they discussed in their abstract at the conference versus what was the primary outcome that was actually presented in their publication. And we found that they were consistent, that there was minimal evidence of spin. But only 75% reported consistent safety endpoints. So this is another point where, you know, trialists often would focus more on efficacy rather than safety. So I think this is an indication of that, where they might have mentioned safety only in the publication, but they didn't mention it in their presentation, or vice versa. So this is, these are kind of new findings. Haven't really shared it yet. We're hoping to share these at the peer review Congress that's happening in September, and hoping to publish this soon as well. And so this brings me to the end of my publication. Thank you so, I'm sorry, my presentation, not publication. Thank you so much for, for being here today and for this opportunity to share. I'm happy to take any questions. Of course, I'd love to stay in touch via email. This is my personal email, and through Twitter. So I'm happy to take any questions. I see there's, I'm just going to stop sharing. I see there's one in the chat. Thank you. So relevant preprint led by colleagues at Bristol. Thank you.
A discrepancy review that, yeah, I think Robbie's
oh, great.
Was involved with.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this.
Thanks a lot for really interesting talk. Are there any questions, Anisa?
Thank you. Yeah, please share any questions. Happy to talk offline as well if anyone is interested in collaborating and, kind of continuing the conversation. Is anyone coming to the peer review Congress? Oh,
I wasn't aware of it, to be honest.
Yeah, so yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how much promotion work they've done. Anyways, it's happening in Chicago in September. And it's a pretty big, it's one of the bigger conferences in our field of meta research that unfortunately had to get canceled or postponed because of the pandemic. But yeah, it's happening in Chicago this year, so which is going to be great. So hopefully there'll be, all the key people involved there and students and other postdocs. I wonder if they'll have a live stream, so that would be kind of cool as well for people who can't make it.
It's interesting, I guess the ethics of the badge study that you conducted, because I was thinking of when you were talking about it that possibly it would be, was it one that ethically would be quite challenging? It does sound like, it's the nature of asking if somebody wants to participate in a badge randomization study could have quite a big impact on their, whether or not they will do the things that they sort of should be doing. So it's a really tricky one.
Right. Or maybe could that, could that make the people in the study the ones that are more interested in data sharing? Or, who, the people that put the hand up, they're like, oh, maybe if I'm, yes, I'm a promoter of data sharing, or two, like, oh, maybe if I share my data, I'll have more likelihood of getting published.
Yeah.
Kind of like, yeah, but, it doesn't, obviously that we clarified that in the email as well. And we didn't tell them what the incentive was. We just said there's a study that's being conducted. You would either be in the control arm or the intervention arm. And, we're looking at data sharing at BmJ Open. So are you willing? I think they had to opt in, actually. They opted in. And then if they opted in, then I would email them and then kind of randomize them to either intervention or control. So the control people just got an email saying, hi, great, thanks, great to see you've opted in to be part of the study. We're just studying the data sharing rates of the BmJ. If you share your data according to the BmJ Open's policy, wonderful, like we didn't tell them what the incentive was. But in the end, those who did share their data, and if they were in the control arm, they still got a badge. But honestly, I mean, you saw the numbers, it was like 4 people, I think, in each arm. So, it's not something that was significant. But I'm just going to look at this question. Yeah, this is a good question, Naomi. Thanks for bringing this up. No, the Riot initiative has been focused on clinical trials. They have not looked at, genetic studies, which are huge, and there is a lot of data that's out there that's behind paywalls, or not even paywalls, just not even shared. But yeah, some of my own studies are looking like the one comparing the NHLBI versus NCI. Those are a lot of genetic studies that we're trying to look at, like what are the data sharing rates there, and what are the shared data publications that are coming out of shared data if they have shared their data. But it will be interesting to see more studies kind of, emerging that are testing incentives, that are looking at data sharing rates, that are doing something about the problem, something similar to Riot, but more for genetic studies. So that's definitely something that hasn't been done in our work anyway. I don't know if others are doing anything directly related to data sharing and genetic studies, but yeah, we definitely that hasn't been something that's been on our agenda. Great. Well, I think
Yeah.
this is to the end, or
Yeah, if there's no other questions, I think, yeah, I'd just like to say thanks very much for agreeing to talk. And I think, yeah, sharing a lot of the work and the opportunities, I guess, as well, that the Riot initiative does, I think could be really of interest to a lot of people. And also the work that you've done, your own exploration into meta research.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all the positive feedback and all the questions and discussion as well. And, I look forward to collaborating with all of you and, following your work. Thank you for sharing the link to the preprint. I look forward to reading it. And yeah, please get in touch anytime. Happy to continue the conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And we'll put the recording of this up on the website.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.